Hey guys, welcome back, it's Meg. Today we're going to go through the first impressions on the War Within beta, a few bosses that we have raid tested so far, as well as the first round of keys. Some disclaimers as always. For keys, we were scaled to 580 eye level, which is pretty low, and the footage was taken before any of the Mythic Plus tuning cycles happened. I'm also missing a ton of buff trackers, and Weakor is an add-on since the only add-on that I actually have on beta is details, and some of these dungeons we were seeing for the first time. So due to the nature of beta, some encounters may also be bugged. For raid testing, we were scaled to 597, and I wanted to experiment with some different builds, so there's that, and then again I was missing a ton of UI elements, and then some portion of the encounters may be bugged. This is the build that I was using for the first few bosses that we tested. This is our Yulon Rising Mist build, and we're using the Conduit of the Celestials hero talents. This build is fairly similar to what we have been running lately in Dragonflight, with the one caveat of Clouded Focus no longer being a thing, and we once again take Rising Mist, so our melee uptime has become much more important. This is due to the interaction that high Renewing Mist count has on our Zen Pulse procs. That is where a lot of our throughput is going to come from, so you want to make sure that you have as many Renewing Mists out as you can. And instead of utilizing our Vivify Cleave, it is now focused mostly on the Zen Pulse procs. For the bosses that we had today during this testing, it is Heroic difficulty. This boss is the Nexus Princess Kaiveza. Next we have Rasha Nan, and then we have Blood Twister Ovinax. For the Nexus Princess, I was trying the Yulon Rising Mist build with Conduit of the Celestials, and we tried a few different strategies to deal with the Gravity Well type thing, but there seems to be quite a bit of movement still. Thankfully, Mistweaver also has lots of movement. This fight feels pretty fast-paced, and the positioning is pretty important. So when it comes to Mistweaver healing the fight, I think we'll do pretty well, considering our melee uptime should be pretty decent, and we have a lot of mobility to deal with the mechanics. Conduit of the Celestials being castable while moving is also pretty impactful, though exact cooldown timers will depend on your comp, and ultimately the tuning once this actually goes live. I don't think that I would play Ancient Teachings Chi-Ji here, since the profile feels more fitting for the Yulon ramps, even on Heroic difficulty. For Rasha Nan, I'm actually super excited for this fight. It felt really great to heal, and I was able to send Yulon on pull to deal with the first set of damage. Overall, between the damage profile for this boss, the mechanics, as well as the stacked and narrow raid grouping, I do think that this is going to be a great Mistweaver fight, but also just a really fun fight for healers in general. Our uptime is pretty high with the boss positioning, and he's sort of a totem boss, but he does move positions for phases. I don't think that this boss would be terrible to run Ancient Teachings, at least on Heroic, but for Mythic and for early prog, I'm definitely going to run Yulon and Rising Mist, barring any major mechanical or tuning changes. There are some adds on this fight which kind of made me curious about running my Jadefire Stomp or my key build basically just for testing, but I don't think that the adds last long enough or spawn frequently enough to make it worth it. I do still think that Yulon and Rising Mist is just the better fit. I think we probably could have dropped one healer for this realistically, but it was nice to kind of have that buffer, and it is raid testing, so numbers aren't so much of a concern, but I do think that it would be a lot easier to see the damage profile outside of the big instances of damage with one less healer. For the last boss during this set of raid testing, I wanted to try the Ancient Teachings build, and I also wanted to try Master of Harmony. It ended up working out pretty well since this boss is actually an ad fight and has tons of cleave targets all the time. So I ended up running a build very similar to what I run in keys, the main difference being the Lotus Infusion instead of Chi Harmony, and then I didn't change the class tree for testing at all. I just ran the same thing the whole way through. Do I think that this is going to be the best build for Mythic Prog? Not at all. Ancient Teachings is still pretty underpowered comparatively, and the Jadefire Stomp cluster is a big point investment for something like Ancient Teachings. But is this something that will probably do okay in Heroic and on late farm? Yeah. When it comes to Master of Harmony, I don't really see a reason to run this over Conduit of the Celestials unless you just don't want to press the extra button and that's not causing throughput issues. But I do think that we're probably just going to end up keeping Conduit all of the time, and then depending on the difficulty of the content that you're doing, or at what point you're doing it, you can get away with the Ancient Teachings build here. I'm not a fan of ad fights in general. This one wasn't as bad, but it does remind me a little bit of Broodkeeper from Vault, So this is just a heroic version, generally not my cup of tea, so I'm not concerned for Mistweaver specifically in the sense, but I'm just generally not looking forward to this fight, I don't think. For the last few expansions, Mistweaver has been kind of split between different profiles of the big bursty Celestial windows through Clouded Focus and Yulon ramps, and lower sustained healing through Chi-Ji and Ancient Teachings for maintenance healing. Each player has their preference, and there's always going to be a best build for each encounter, and typically one playstyle is more dominant than the other. But unless you're going for Hall of Fame or other competitive mythic rating, you can get away with basically any build as long as you're pulling your weight and positioned appropriately for mechanics. I say this because Monk is always a melee-coded class and we receive mechanics as such, but we're also a healer, so we may avoid certain mechanics entirely. It really depends on the fight on how impactful this is, but it is something to keep in mind. Regardless, Rising Mist has gained a ton of value back with the new Zen Pulse, which requires high renewing mist counts once again, and it's very likely we'll end up using it in any build that we run. Overall performance feels very strong and fluid. Outside of cooldowns, healing feels very stable and meaningful for Mistweaver, and the Zen Pulse rework has been very good both in keys and in raid. Other talents like Pool of Mist and Crane Style have helped with the cohesivity of the spec. The healer philosophy changed as a result, the new revival scaling feels fantastic, and hopefully it will scale better into the expansion as opposed to what happened in Dragonflight, where it felt really good in the first season and then kind of dropped off as we got stronger. The main complaint that I have currently for Mistweaver is surrounding Chi-Ji and how lackluster it feels. It's kind of missing that oomph that CDs need to have. And Chi Cocoon has also caught a slight nerf, and that's currently the only impactful part of the entire Chi-Ji cooldown. I've tried running Jade Bond and it still feels weaker than the live version with a significant less amount mastery. And on beta, even focusing mastery and running what would be considered a Chi-Ji build, it still just cannot move health bars. This is partially a result of the removal of Essence Font and that double Gust of Mist proc that we got as a result. But even as someone that rarely uses the Essence Font HOT, even in retail currently, since we run a full range comp and I don't actually use the Essence Font spell ever, our mastery was buffed during alpha or early beta, but it's just not making up the difference from the Essence Font loss and the generally poor scaling and poor value on mastery. Thankfully, there's a few ways to fix this. Number one would be to improve our mastery scaling at a base level. Mastery is basically useless in raid and kind of always has been, and in keys it's still not exceptional, but it is part of our major cooldown. Giving Mistweaver better mastery scaling would have minimal impact on raid balance while fixing the Mystic Plus issues that we currently face. Solution number two would be to adjust the number of Gusts of Mist proc during Chi-Ji instead of increasing mastery. This would give us more moderately sized Gusts of Mist during Chi-Ji as opposed to just bigger gusts if we just were to improve the mastery. Increasing the Gust of Mist during Chi-Ji would probably be one of the better solutions, but you would have to be aware of how much you're increasing it by on single target versus AoE encounters. The third solution would be to add in a % mastery increase during Chi-Ji only to help empower the cooldown without impacting the player's Gust of Mist all of the time. Jade Bond does this due to the longer cooldown to make it stronger, however I believe that we're at the point where Jade Bond or portions of it could just be baked into Chi-Ji or into Empowered Celestial. And lastly, they could buff player and or Chi-Ji healing during Celestial, just have a blanket healing increase during the cooldown. I think this would be my preferred option, but I understand that it opens up a whole new issue between balancing Chi-Ji and Yulon, and also player power during Chi-Ji if you were to just end up casting all of your spells and empowering your HOTS. I think realistically they could also add a damage amp somewhere in there, similar to the way that old Way of the Crane power from BFA worked. Any of the changes or combination of bits and pieces could work to solve the issue of our main cooldown doing negligible healing. Raid-wise, I'm pretty impressed with Zen Pulse and the general playstyle. With Clouded Focus's removal, raid healing has become a lot more dynamic and engaging, and it's likely that we'll even have multiple viable builds. For dungeons, I am running the standard Mythic Plus build. There's a few things in the class tree that could change for raging weeks or situations where you need Transcendence-linked spirits for something, but this is typically what my tree will look like. On the spec side, you could take the extra point out of Pool of Mist and put it into Secret Infusion or Focus Thunder, but I've been really enjoying Pool lately. Conduit of the Celestials is basically access to another cooldown plus a bunch of really nice passives, so I'll mostly be playing that, but Master of Harmony may see some play depending on what I'm doing. My first impression of the Stone Vault is that I have some concerns with overtuned trash and bosses like Edna. This footage was taken pre-nerf, so this boss has changed it a little bit, but between the pug unfriendliness with the coordination required and the nightmare that is being in melee on this boss, I hope that these get addressed. The dungeon overall has smaller hallways and corridors, and densely packed rooms of trash, so what I'm hoping is a bug. A boss also has a fervent strike. I do think that overall it's fun if we're looking past all of the tuning issues and bug fixes, so I would probably give this one an 8 out of 10 on first impressions. For the Dawnbreaker dungeon, there is as many concerns as there is cool stuff. This is the Dragonflying dungeon, and much like the Not Good Offensive and Dragonflight, it is a huge zone with many different portions of the dungeon. I have some issues with the boats and the ground effects with pets and stuff, but I also have concerns with the actual motion of the ships that we're on. Back in the Grimrail Depot in Shadowlands, there was a potion that you could drink that would stop the visual of the speeding train to help with motion sickness, but unlike Dawnbreaker, we weren't actually in motion. I don't know if there's a similar fix for this dungeon since we're actually moving, but as someone who doesn't get motion sick, I was still aware of the movement. Along with the motion, there's also problems with ground effects and abilities migrating. In this clip you can see I placed my Jadefire Stomp into the pack, but it actually appears a bit away from me, over to the left. It's not just a visual issue, as you can see my Awakened Jadefire and Ancient Concordance buffs ticking down, showing that I'm not standing in my stomp at all. Pets have also been falling off of the boats, and some other ground effects cause issues with projectiles. The bosses are very cool though. I had fun figuring out each of them and seeing them for the first time on beta. I like the mechanics and the cadence to the fights. Just like other dungeons, there's some tuning issues, but I'm not super focused on those since it is just the first round of testing. I do think that there is some issue with visual clarity or bugged visuals, but I do think that overall this dungeon's really fun and unique, and though Last Moss may be lengthy and sort of overwhelming for pugs, I think that this is just going to be something that we'll have to wait and see. Overall, on first impressions, I want to give the Dawnbreaker like a 9 out of 10. I do have concerns with the motion, and I'm worried that the floor is never going to get fixed, but I actually had a really good time in this dungeon overall. And I'm really excited to see it in a key after tuning passes and after a couple of other mechanical changes. Arakawa, City of Echoes. I actually really like this instance. There's some cool environment stuff like the eggs popping if you run over them, and that will cause a slow. But I do have to say some of the trash is a bit oppressive in terms of how many casts they have or how often they recast with no lockout. This has been a problem before with there just being too many stops, but the dungeon-specific special item or mechanic, whatever you want to call it, can be used to prevent some of this. That being said, if you don't have a tailor, you can't use it. Outside of this final area, you can mount everywhere in this dungeon, which I really appreciate. I hate dungeons where they're appearing to be outside, but you can't actually mount, like Vortex Pinnacle from a few seasons ago, and generally I feel like mounting should just be allowed in all dungeons. The last boss is very neat for personal responsibility, and overall I think it's a pretty solid dungeon. I would give it probably a 7 out of 10, because I don't necessarily like when mobs have damage reduction auras on them, because it does make chaining more difficult. For the City of Threads, unfortunately I don't have any footage because we were only able to do the first boss in there, since we had an issue with the instance causing everyone to DC and then the dungeon would reset itself. So I can't really form an opinion of the dungeon yet, but the first boss was pretty unique. It does rely heavily on the tank being on top of positioning, and it can be punishing if they are not proactive with their movement. But I do want to wait to see the rest of the dungeon, and then I will go over that in a future video. Grim Batol is a Cataclysm dungeon that has been semi-reworked into a Mythic Plus dungeon, but it honestly didn't get changed as much as I was hoping that it would. The beginning trash area still contains the taxi dragons, and they do much less damage than they should in my opinion. The first boss got reworked entirely, and he's pretty neat, but there is some visual clarity issues. The rest of the dungeon is linear, and though the trash has changed, the bosses remain mostly the same. There's no mounting in this dungeon at all, and the checkpoints are not as frequent as I would like. I'm of the opinion that there should be a graveyard after each boss is defeated, and that goes for any dungeon. Overall, this dungeon kinda has me feeling meh, and it's a bit of a slog in general. So on first impressions, I'll give it a 4 out of 10, but I do hope that I'm wrong and that it actually turns into a better key as we get through tuning and as we kind of get more comfortable with routing. Mist of Tyrannosaith is a returning dungeon from Shadowlands, and I have the same concerns about this dungeon as we did back in current content. The first boss scales horribly with Tyrannical. The second does as well, but not nearly as bad as the first. The maze, being both RNG for count as well as combat gated, becomes a massive time sink, and there were times in Shadowlands where if we got the wrong maze on a certain key level, we would just zone out since we knew we wouldn't have the time or the correct count. They've also added buffs to the dungeon, which you can no longer stop the bite from the foxes that will one-shot on a high key when we used to be able to prevent it. There's also a new AoE ability in the final trash area that is not stoppable, but it had a cast bar so you could prepare, and the cast bar has been removed. We do have weak auras that can show enemy cooldowns on nameplates, but sometimes spell queuing can be funny and not line up. Lastly, the Night Fae Graveyard and the door powers have been changed to Night Elf, Druid, and Herbalist, I believe, so that's at least a night's change, so that's more accessible, but that doesn't fix the rest of the issues that we have with this dungeon, especially with how poorly it scales. Necrotic Wake is the second Shadowlands dungeon returning, and outside of our Covenant powers, this dungeon hasn't really changed. There's been some mechanical changes on the spears, and the hammers and Goliaths have been removed, which may show more impact in higher Tyrant keys since you have less tools to break the shields on the last boss. But in Shadowlands, this dungeon was one of the easier ones, and I expect it to remain that way as we head into the War Within. I don't dislike Necrotic Wake, but it was also a bit of a homework key since it was the easiest to 2-chest, and I could see that happening again in the War Within. I don't have any footage for Siege of Borealis, but I do firmly believe that Siege is one of the worst Mythic Plus dungeons that they have ever made. This is a Battle for Azeroth dungeon returning, and back in BFA there was 2 sides, Horde or Alliance, and it was significantly harder as an Alliance player due to the mob differences. The bad news is that in the War Within, the dungeon will always be Alliance side. The worst news is that the one redeeming factor of this dungeon has been removed. We used to be able to use the spotters to mass pull and use friendly fire to kill the mobs, and this is no longer a thing. The bosses are extremely buggy, and I've not seen any notes regarding that, nor do I really expect there to be. Some of the damage in here has been tuned down, but this dungeon is straight up not enjoyable. And just to wrap up, there's a few housekeeping and minor things like bug or wishlist items that realistically could be implemented. It's no secret that I am a big supporter of the idea of role abilities like Brez being something available to all healers, but at this point in the development cycle, I don't see it happening. First off is the issue that I have with Conduit of the Celestials. The channel will pull things from very, very far, even if you're not in combat with it, and I sincerely hope that that is something that they're looking at, because a lot of these dungeons are smaller corridors or tighter rooms that it could pull through walls, or it could even just pull other mobs in the room. You can see in the top left of my screen during this poll that I get a random proc on my Zwen, and he just pops up in the middle of the pack and decides that we're going to be fighting that now. Even though we were not in combat with that, I was not targeting it, I was barely even facing in that direction, and he just triggers on them. So between the actual channel of Conduit of the Celestials and the random procs that we get on our Celestials, I do hope that this is something that they're aware of and that they're looking at, so that they can fix it, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to play Conduit in keys. Next up is the Overwhelming Force visual for the Master of Harmony hero talents. The visual is very large, but the actual range on the ability is, I want to say melee range, it might be even smaller, so I'm hoping that they would make it more true to the visual. I do have concerns of it pulling if it is that way, but I think that we're missing out on a lot of value due to the limitations on where we're facing, and then the distance of mobs, especially with how little mobs actually like to move. I think that it would be a really nice quality of life change if they just increase the range on Overwhelming Force to about the range of our Blackout Kit cleaves. And just a summary of a few things, again, that I'm hoping get looked at before launch. Lighter Than Air being stackable, even up to 2, would be nice quality of life. It may just be a habit of spam rolling, but to be able to roll twice without losing Lighter Than Air value would be really nice. Chi-Ji and Mastery is my main concern, like we talked about earlier. I sincerely hope that we get some tuning for our Mastery or Chi-Ji specifically, otherwise I think that Season 1 is going to be super rough. Chi-Burst rework I already discussed in a short, but it would be awesome if we could potentially gain stacks at least up to 2, similar to Zen Pulse, to allow Mistweaver to have some single target burst damage, since we have never had access to that single target damage profile. Currently, Paralysis is a great piece of utility for Mistweaver that can facilitate skips without triggering combat when used with Rob. However, We now have a Soothe that is baked into Paralysis through the talent pressure points. I'm so glad that we have access to a Soothe now, and I'm very excited to be able to use it, but while we are talented into pressure points, Paralysis can no longer be used for skips as it triggers combat when it attempts to Soothe. Ideally, I would like it if Paralysis would not attempt to soothe a target if it's not in combat, or if it would not attempt to soothe if it's not engaged. Being pigeonholed into one use, one of those things during something like Raging Week would feel really terrible, and it would kind of divide the use of the spell, which is not something that we would want. And that is all I have for you guys today. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitch or Discord, or down in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.